So let's try and work out some problems that involve fractions, because I realize that fractions sometimes freak you guys out a little bit. So we have a problem here with the fraction 1/4 being multiplied to the quantity x minus 8, and that equals 7. And we're going to go ahead and see if we can figure out what x is. So again, just like in every problem you've done before, we're trying to get the x completely by itself in this equation. And we're going to use the same rules that we always would if we had just a regular whole number sitting outside of a parentheses with a quantity inside it. Meaning we are going to distribute. We're going to distribute this 1/4 times the x, and then we're going to distribute the 1/4 times the 8. So let's go ahead and do that. 1/4 times x gives us 1/4 x minus 1/4 times 8. So let me write it out like this. 1/4 times 8 equals, and then we still have the 7 on the right-hand side. Okay, so when you multiply a fraction times a whole number, little thought bubble off to the side here, a fraction times a whole number, you can simply turn that whole number into a fraction by putting it over 1. And now, when you multiply fractions, you simply multiply the tops, 1 times 8, and then multiply the bottoms, 4 times 1, giving us, in this case, 8 over 4, which is equivalent to 2. So, instead of 1/4 x minus this stuff, I'm going to replace this stuff with a 2 equals 7. All right, now I realize we still have a fraction in here, but it's okay. I'm going to show you a little trick on how we can get rid of this fraction very easily when we need to. But let's just consider the problem that we have here and recognize if this were a whole number, we would normally, in this kind of problem, get rid of anything being added or subtracted to the x first. So we're not even going to worry about this fraction for just a moment. We're going to deal with this minus 2 by adding 2 to both sides of the equation. As you remember, the number one rule in algebra is whatever I do on one side of the equation, I must do on the other side. So the whole point of adding 2 is to make this negative 2 or minus 2 go away. And adding 2 does that. So all I have left on the left side of my equation is 1/4 x. On the other side of my equation, I have 7 plus 2, which equals 9. Now I'm ready to take care of this 1/4. Well, normally, if we have a number being multiplied to a variable, we divide by that value. So we could divide by 1/4, and that would make this go away. But dividing by a fraction can be a little bit confusing for you guys. So rather than dividing by a fraction, I'm going to show you a trick that we can do instead. Instead of dividing by a fraction, you can multiply by the inverse of this fraction, or in other words, the flip of this fraction. So the inverse of 1/4 is 4/1. So I'm literally going to multiply the left side of the equation by 4/1. Now remember, if you multiply one side of the equation, you must also multiply the other side of the equation by the same value, 4/1. The whole point of multiplying this side by 4/1, or the inverse of 1/4, is to make this 1/4 turn into a 1. And it does that. 4 times 1 gives us 4. 1 times 4 gives us 4. And that's still times x. 4/4 is just a 1, or just plain old x. And that's exactly what we wanted. We didn't want 1/4 x's. We wanted 1 x. And that's what multiplying this side by the inverse does. It gives us 1 x. Now let's talk about the right side. 9 is getting multiplied times 4/1, or by a fraction. Well, it's fine. We can turn 9 into a fraction very easily by just putting it over 1. And again, when you multiply fractions, you multiply the tops, you multiply the bottoms, you get an answer. So 9 times 4 gives us 36. 1 times 1 gives us 1. 36/1 is the same thing as just 36. So here is our final answer. So again, the little trick that we worked on here is if you have a fraction connected to your variable and you have to get rid of that fraction, just multiply by the inverse. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at another kind of algebra equation where you have to solve for a variable where fractions are involved. Like this one. This problem would be a super simple problem if there were no divided by 3 in this equation. But we have the divided by 3 and we have to deal with it. We can't just ignore it. So, I'm going to show you a trick how we can get rid of this 3 super easy and turn this problem into a super easy algebra problem. If you have a side of your equation that the entire side is being divided by a number, you can multiply that entire side by whatever that number is. So since this side is being divided by a 3, I'm going to multiply this side of the equation by 3. And the whole point of doing that is to get rid of this 3. 3 over 3, or 1 over 1, just sort of cancels each other out, and I'm left with x minus 15. Now, remember, the number 1 rule in algebra, if you multiply one side of the equation by 3, you must also multiply everything on the other side by 3. So 9 times 3 gives me a 27. Now it's a simple one-step equation. Just add 15 to get rid of that negative 15. But remember, you have to do that on both sides of the equation. I'm left with x on the left side. 27 plus 15 gives me 42 on the right side. All right, so anytime you're faced with an equation where the entire left side of the equation, for example, is being divided by some number, super easy to get rid of that number. Just multiply that whole side by that number, in this case 3, and it makes it cancel it out. But remember to multiply the other side by that same number. Okay, we have one more equation to look at that has variables, that has fractions mixed into it. This one's got this negative 3/4 over here. And so I think you guys would agree with me that we would probably tackle this equation by first distributing this negative 3/4 times this, and then this negative 3/4 times this. So let's go ahead and do that. The left side of the equation doesn't change. We have 3 minus 5w plus 14 equals negative 3/4 times 12w plus negative 3/4 times 4. All right, so we still have fractions, but we'll take care of those in just a second. So I'm going to leave everything on the left side alone just for another minute here, because I don't see, oops, put an X instead of a W. Sorry about that. Because I don't see any fractions on the left side to deal with, so we're going to deal with all of our fractions first. All right, so again, if we have a fraction being multiplied times a whole number or some whole value expression, we can just put it over 1. And when we multiply these, we multiply the tops, we multiply the bottoms, we get an answer. So negative 3 times 12 gives me a negative 36w. 4 times 1 gives me 4. Plus, again, I have a fraction being multiplied times a whole number, so I'll turn this into a fraction. And again, multiply the tops, multiply the bottoms. Negative 3 times 4 gives me a negative 12. And then 4 times 1 gives me 4. So I'm going to do a little simplifying here because negative 36 over 4 equals negative 9. And that's still multiplied times the w. And negative 12 over 4 gives me a negative 3. So plus a negative 3 is the same thing as just minus 3. So I'm going to go ahead and take care of the middleman and get rid of this plus sign right away. So all of this stuff, this negative 3/4 getting multiplied times the 12w plus 4, boils down to this when we just distribute this fraction into each of these terms. No longer do we have a fraction. All right, so that was nice. The fraction's gone. Just need to be very careful on how you multiply your fractions, turning the other objects into fractions, multiplying the tops, multiplying the bottoms, and then simplifying. Now there is a little factor over on the left side of the equation we need to deal with. This minus sign is not just being applied to this 5w. It is getting distributed as well. It's almost like saying there's a -1 here. And so if we were to distribute a -1, it would get multiplied times the 5w, and then it would get multiplied times the 14. So if I do that, I would have 3, and then a -1 times 5w gives me a -5w, plus -1 times 14 gives me a -14. Now, if I group together the terms that I have on my left-hand side, I have a +3 with a -14, so that gives me a grand total of -11 over here. And then I also still have the -5w. And on the other side of the equation, I have -9w minus 3. Now it's just an equation where we have to get all the variables together on one side, all the constants together on the other side, and then solve for, in this case, w. So I'm going to bring the w's to the left side by adding 9w, getting rid of the w's on the left, or on the right. But again, I have to do the same thing on this side, add a 9w, that's supposed to be a plus sign. So when I do that, I have a -11, -5w, plus 9w gives me 4w's. And then over on the other side, I have just a -3 left. So now I'm going to add 11 from the left side so that it goes away, but I need to add 11 on this side as well. Can't forget that. Giving me 4w left on the left side, and then a -3 added to 11 gives me 8 on the right side. Let me bring it up here so I have some more room to work with. So at this point I have 4w equals 8. And all I have to do now is just get rid of this 4, divide both sides by 4. You guys know how to do that, super easy. 4 over 4 gives me 1, or just w like I'm looking for. 8 divided by 4 gives me 2, so my final answer is 2. So I think that you guys have the ability to do problems like this, but there's a lot of little pieces in this problem where you can make careless mistakes. So when you're working on these problems, it's very crucial that you stay focused through the entire problem and don't take for granted any of the arithmetic that's involved. Adding and subtracting positive and negative numbers, multiplying positive and negative numbers. Remember your sign rules. Okay, I hope this video helped you when it comes to involving fractions and solving equations. Have a great day.